My name is Kayla and I didn't know how clearly my family had ranked me until my mother said it out loud at dinner. Not angry, not emotional, just calm. Your sister's family always comes first, she said. You are always last. My dad nodded like it was basic math. My sister, Sydney, just smirked into her wine. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I just looked at them and said, it is good to know that. Because in that second, something snapped. Not my heart. My loyalty. Drop a comment and let me know where you are listening from and what time it is for you right now. I would love to know who is part of our community. I didn't wait for dessert. I didn't wait for an apology that I knew would never come. I drove back to Chicago in the kind of silence that feels like a clean slate. While the city lights blurred past my window, I wasn't mourning. I was calculating. I pulled into my garage at nearly midnight, but I didn't go to bed. I didn't even take off my coat. I sat at my kitchen table and opened my laptop. The blue light felt honest, unlike the warm, fake glow of my parents' dining room. My mother's voice kept looping in my head. You're always last. It was a clinical observation to her. A fact of life. A rank in a hierarchy I never agreed to join. Fine. If I was last on their list of priorities, they were officially off of mine. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was clinical. It was a balance sheet. I started with the network. As a network administrator, I had built the entire digital infrastructure for my family. I hosted their cloud storage. I managed their security. I even paid the monthly premiums for the high-speed fiber line at their house because they told me I made the most money, and it was the least I could do. I looked at the dashboard. My sister was currently streaming a movie. My father was browsing the web. I watched their data packets move across the screen. I felt nothing but the cold urge to disconnect. I changed the primary administrative passwords and disabled every remote access point. In an instant, their digital world went dark. Next, I opened my banking app. Sydney was still an authorized user on one of my high-limit cards. My parents had convinced me she needed it for emergencies, while she was getting her flower shop off the ground. I scrolled through the recent transactions. A $250 dinner. A $400 charge at a boutique. My compassion had been a luxury they had overdrafted for years. They treated my bank account like a public utility. I clicked on her name, selected Remove User, and confirmed the deletion. By 12:03 a.m., the retaliation was complete. No yelling. No crying. Just a series of logical deletions. I'd been the silent investor in their version of family, footing the bill for a subscription I no longer wanted. I stared at the blinking cursor on my screen. I didn't feel like a victim. I felt like an accountant closing a failed business. I closed my laptop and looked out at the Chicago skyline. For the first time in 28 years, I wasn't bracing myself for their next demand. I was a stranger with a boundary. And inside, my laptop glowed with a different kind of sunrise. The kind made of facts, numbers, and quiet retribution. The silence that followed my digital shutdown was heavy, but it was clear. In the absence of their constant pings and demands, I could finally hear my own thoughts. I didn't spend the next week waiting for their calls. I spent it digging into the one thing they couldn't touch through a server, the 50 acres of Nashville land my grandfather had left specifically to me. He was the only one who saw the slant of the family hierarchy before I did. He told me the land was my future, my safety net, because he knew no one else would catch me if I fell. I sat in my Chicago office and pulled up the Davidson County property records. My stomach didn't churn, it stayed flat and cold, like a stone in a frozen lake. I searched my name and waited for the PDF to load. When it appeared, the numbers on the screen felt like a physical weight. There was a lien on the property. A mortgage. $120,000 had been taken out against my land 3 years ago. The funds were disbursed to a business account registered to Sydney's flower shop. I leaned back and stared at the ceiling. I thought about the invisible chain I had been wearing since I was 10 years old. My parents, Sarah and Joshua, always described me as the strong one. They said I was so independent that it was like I didn't even need parents. For a long time, I took that as a compliment. I wore my self-sufficiency like a badge of honor. But looking at that $120,000 debt, I finally understood the truth. I grew up in a prison without bars. My independence wasn't a choice, it was a survival mechanism. They called me strong so they could stop carrying their share of the weight. They ignored my awards and skipped my ceremonies because they knew I would just keep moving forward. Being the survivor meant I was the one who didn't get to have a childhood because I was too busy being their backup plan. I was the bridge they walked over to reach Sydney, the daughter who actually mattered. The strong one is just a convenient label for the person you intend to exploit. They didn't think I'd check the records because I was too busy with work and always fine. They assumed I would just keep paying the property taxes on a legacy they were secretly dismantling. They took my anchor and handed it to Sydney to keep her failing business afloat. They didn't just rank me last, they stole from the only person who had ever truly prioritized me, my grandfather. I looked at the mortgage documents again. The date of the loan was the same week I had moved to Chicago. While I was packing boxes and starting a new life with zero help from them, they were in a notary's office, trading my future for Sydney's comfort. $120,000. It was a massive number, a calculated betrayal. I didn't call them to scream. I didn't send an angry text. I just opened a new folder on my desktop and labeled it, the Nashville property case. I'd been the infrastructure of this family for far too long. If they wanted me to be a bank, then it was time for them to realize that banks don't have hearts. They only have contracts. And my contract with this family was officially null and void. Instead of a phone call or a moment of reflection, my phone buzzed with a notification from Venmo. Sydney had sent a request for $650 with a note that said, "School supplies for the kids," followed by a heart emoji. 10 minutes later, she posted a photo on Instagram featuring a new designer handbag with the caption, "Treating myself because life is too short for anything but the best." The blatant audacity was almost impressive. She wasn't just taking my money, she was using it to fund a performance of a life she couldn't actually afford. My mother, Sarah, called an hour later. She didn't ask about the digital blackout or the fact that I had disappeared from the shared family data plan. She went straight to the gaslighting. "Kayla, we ranked you last because we were proud of you," she said, her voice dripping with a fake, forced sweetness. "You're so strong and stable that you don't need us to survive. Sydney is different. She needs our protection. Why can't you understand that your strength is a gift to this family?" I listened to her and realized that her version of a love was actually an invoice. To them, my success wasn't my own achievement, it was a resource they had a natural right to harvest. They were suffering from the illusion of power that often comes with a hollow wallet. Because they had nothing of their own, they had convinced themselves that my life and my assets were simply an extension of theirs. They confused their roles as parents with a deed of ownership over my future. This is the trap of the empty wallet. When people build their entire identity on a status they've rented with someone else's money, they lose any sense of intrinsic value. To my mother and Sydney, I wasn't a person, I was a public utility. I was the infrastructure that kept their delusions running. They didn't feel guilty about exploiting me because, in their minds, I only existed to serve the higher priority of the family image. When I didn't respond to the call or the Venmo request, the mask of the golden child finally slipped. Sydney posted a public status on Facebook that read, "It's funny how some people forget who raised them the moment they get a little bit of success. Bitter siblings who hoard their money are the reason families fall apart. Real family shows up when there's a crisis." I watched the likes from distant relatives roll in, and for the first time, I didn't feel the urge to explain myself. The indignation was there, but it was cold and controlled. They weren't shocked by what they had done to me. They were shocked that I had stopped playing my part. I looked at the screenshot of her post and added it to the evidence folder. The transaction of our relationship was over. I wasn't just a bank anymore, I was a creditor, and I was about to start the collection process. Anger is a blunt tool. It breaks things without fixing them, and I was done being broken. I didn't need a shouting match, I needed a scalpel. I spent the next few days in a world of ledgers and legalities, far away from the emotional noise of my mother's voicemails. I hired a forensic accountant in Chicago and a real estate attorney based in Nashville. I didn't give them a story about a daughter who was ranked last. I gave them property deeds, bank statements, and a clear objective. I wasn't looking for an apology anymore. I was looking for the $120,000. The forensic accountant moved through my family's financial history with the same cold precision I used on my servers. Within 48 hours, he had mapped the money trail. It wasn't a pretty picture. The mortgage taken out against my land hadn't just been a temporary business cushion for Sydney's flower shop. It had been a secondary income for my parents. They had used the equity to pay for Sydney's country club memberships and luxury vacations, all while telling me that they were struggling to keep the lights on. My compassion had been a resource they had strip-mined for years. I had my lawyer draft a formal notice of revocation. It was a sterile, 3-page document that informed Sarah and Joshua that, as the sole trustee of the Nashville property, I was revoking all implied access. I was demanding a full, line-item accounting of the $120,000 they had withdrawn within 30 days. If they couldn't produce the records or a repayment schedule, I would move to have the lien cleared through a civil suit. The language in the letter was dry and crystalline. It didn't say I was hurt. It didn't mention the dinner where they told me I was last. It didn't ask why they thought it was okay to steal my inheritance. It treated them exactly like a third-party vendor that had defaulted on a contract. For 28 years, I had been the family's strong one, a durable piece of equipment they used until it was convenient to ignore. I realized then that my strength had never been a compliment to them. It was a justification for their neglect. I had the notice delivered via certified mail. I wanted a physical signature. I wanted a record that they had held the consequences of their actions in their own hands. I sat in my Chicago apartment and watched the tracking number update. When the notification popped up saying you delivered and signed, I didn't feel a surge of triumph. I felt the kind of stillness that comes after a long, exhausting storm has finally passed. I thought about how my mother always said family comes first. Now I understood her definition. Family was the camouflage they used to hide their exploitation. When they needed emotional labor, I was a daughter. When they needed $120,000, I was infrastructure. I looked at the tracking confirmation and felt a profound sense of clarity. I wasn't the last-ranked daughter anymore. I was a creditor, and the bill was finally due. The call from my lawyer, Marcus, came on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. He didn't start with small talk or pleasantries. He simply said, "Kayla, we found the kill shot." I sat at my desk in Chicago, the city noise humming outside, and waited for the numbers to align with the crime. Marcus explained that the forensic audit of the Nashville property hadn't just revealed where the money went, it revealed exactly how it was taken. The $120,000 hadn't just been a temporary loan for Sydney's flower shop. It hadn't even been spent on flowers or inventory. Sydney's husband, the man my parents constantly praised as a successful investor, had been siphoning those funds into a high-stakes offshore gambling account. He wasn't building a business, he was burning through my grandfather's legacy to chase a winning hand. My parents, Sarah and Joshua, hadn't just been supportive, they had been enablers of a fraud that went far deeper than a failing franchise business. But the real lethal discovery was in the ink. Marcus had pulled the original mortgage documents from the notary's office in Nashville. He sent a high-resolution scan to my email. I looked at the signature line where my name was supposed to be. It was a practiced hand, but it wasn't mine. My father, the man who had nodded along at dinner when I was ranked last, had sat in that office and signed my name 3 years ago. He had committed identity theft and forgery against his own daughter to fund his son-in-law's gambling addiction. I stared at the screen, the blue light reflecting in my eyes, and I felt a profound sense of clinical clarity. This wasn't a family drama anymore, it was an accounting of crimes. I didn't feel the sting of betrayal or the urge to cry. I felt like I was looking at a bug in a system that needed to be patched. They had mistaken my silence for submission, and my strength for an invitation to exploit. They didn't think I would check because, in their world, I was just the infrastructure, the bridge that existed only to be walked on. Now, the bridge was gone, and they were standing on a ledge of their own making. The forged signature was the evidence that removed any remaining path to redemption. They aren't just ungrateful or biased, they are criminals who had traded my future for a seat at a poker table. Marcus asked me if I wanted to wait. I told him no. I had my lawyer draft a formal notification of the evidence and set a meeting at my office for the following weekend. Anger wasn't necessary. Facts were enough. My father's signature on that deed was the only apology I would ever need, because it was the only one that carried the weight of a prison sentence. I closed the laptop, and for the first time in my life, the weight of being the strong one felt like power instead of a burden. The air in my Chicago office was stale and recycled, a perfect match for the desperate entitlement sitting across from me. Sydney sat between our parents, her face blotchy from crying, while my father, Joshua, tried to maintain the posture of a man who still held the cards. He didn't know that I had already seen his hand, and I knew exactly how much he had cheated to stay in the game. Joshua cleared his throat, the sound sharp in the absolute silence. He told me that Sydney was on the verge of losing her home. He said the bank was closing in, and that as the one in a stable position, I needed to step in and fix the numbers. He spoke about family loyalty as if it were an interest-free loan he could perpetually renew. I didn't interrupt. I let him finish his rehearsed speech about how families should catch each other when they fall. When he finally stopped, I didn't reach for a checkbook. I reached into my desk and pulled out the high-resolution scan of the Nashville deed. I slid it across the table. I watched the color drain from my father's face as he saw his own handiwork, the forged signature he had written 3 years ago. Next, I slid the forensic audit showing the $120,000 that had been siphoned into an offshore gambling account. The silence that followed was heavy and undeniable. My mother, Sarah, reached for my hand, her voice trembling. She told me they never meant to make me feel like I was last. I gently pulled my hand back and looked at her. I told her that they did mean it, and they had even said it out loud. I reminded them of that dinner where they told me I was the infrastructure, the safety net that didn't need a heart. I told them, I am being good to know. I delivered the terms with the cold precision of a closing statement. I told them they had 6 months to repay the $120,000 to my grandfather's trust. I informed them that Sydney's flower shop would be sold to recover the initial capital, and if the debt wasn't cleared, I would take the evidence of forgery and identity theft directly to the district attorney. My sister shrieked that I was destroying her life, but I simply looked at her and said that I was stopping the destruction of mine. They weren't being punished, they were finally being held accountable to the laws of a reality I had been forced to live in since I was 10 years old. The aftermath didn't happen in a movie moment. It was a slow, methodical reclamation. The shop was sold, the debts were restructured, and the Nashville land was finally secured in my name alone. A few months later, I stood on that acreage, watching the sunrise hit the long grass. I realized then that this wasn't just about the money or the land. This was planter's justice. For 28 years, I had been the silent investor in their version of family, but now I was planting a different kind of legacy. I wasn't waiting to be chosen or ranked anymore. I had already chosen myself. I opened my phone and deleted the contact group labeled a family. I renamed the file, the Nashville property case, and archived it. That night, for the first time in my life, I didn't feel the weight of their expectations pressing down on my chest. I felt light. I felt clean. Justice isn't always about a gavel, sometimes, it's just a boundary that can no longer be crossed. If you have ever had to build your own safety net because the people who raised you wouldn't catch you, share this story. Let's remind each other that choosing yourself isn't selfish, it's survival. Hit subscribe for more stories of justice and resilience.